The metal screamed as it bent under the pressure of 10,000 atmospheres. Deep beneath the crushing waters of Oceanus Prime, where no natural light had touched for millennia, something impossible was happening. The ancient vault that had withstood 1,000 years of crushing darkness was finally giving way. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dr. Elena Vasquez pressed her palm against the observation window of the deep-sea research vessel Meridian, watching the robotic arms work to extract what her team had discovered 3 days ago. The artifact they'd found wasn't like anything in the archaeological records. It was a perfect sphere of unknown metal, roughly 4 meters in diameter, covered in symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly. More disturbing still were the energy readings emanating from within, pulsing with a rhythm that almost resembled a heartbeat. The water around the sphere glowed with an eerie phosphorescence as the extraction beam lifted it from the ocean floor. Sediment that had accumulated over centuries cascaded down like a waterfall of time itself, revealing more of the sphere's pristine surface. Whatever civilization had created this had possessed technology far beyond anything the current galactic community understood. Elena's colleague, Dr. Marcus Chen, floated beside her in the zero-gravity observation chamber, his brow furrowed as he studied the readings on his tablet. "The energy signature is getting stronger the closer we bring it to the surface," he said, his voice tight with concern. "Elena, I'm reading biological indicators from inside that thing. Something is alive in there." Before Elena could respond, their communication system crackled to life. "Research Vessel Meridian, this is Orbital Command. You are ordered to cease all recovery operations immediately and return to base. The Council of Worlds has classified your discovery as a Level 9 containment risk." Elena exchanged a glance with Marcus. Level 9 classifications were reserved for threats that could potentially destabilize entire star systems. She had never heard of one being issued for an archaeological find. "Orbital Command, we're already committed to the extraction. The artifact is responding to our presence. Aborting now could be more dangerous than proceeding." "Negative, Meridian. The Hegemony Archive has identified your discovery. That artifact contains a human, and under Galactic Statute 2847, all human remains must be destroyed immediately upon discovery." The words hit Elena like a physical blow. A human? That was impossible. Humans had been extinct for over 1,000 years, wiped out during the Great Purification when the galaxy had united to eliminate what the histories called the most dangerous species ever to achieve space travel. Every child learned about the human war in school, how an entire species had to be sacrificed to save the galaxy from their destructive nature. But if the archive was correct, they had just found a human who had somehow survived for a millennium. Elena's scientific mind raced with possibilities while her heart hammered with fear and excitement in equal measure. "Marcus," she whispered, "cut the communication link." "Elena, you can't be serious. If that thing really contains a human, then we have the greatest archaeological discovery in galactic history," Elena interrupted. "And they want us to destroy it without even studying it." Marcus hesitated, his finger hovering over the communication controls. Like Elena, he was a scientist first, and the thought of destroying such a unique find without investigation went against everything he believed in. But he was also a citizen of the hegemony, and defying direct orders from the Council of Worlds was tantamount to treason. The sphere pulsed brighter, and suddenly every instrument on the ship began registering massive energy fluctuations. Whatever was inside was reacting to their conversation, to their proximity, or perhaps to something else entirely. Elena made the decision that would change everything. "Do it, Marcus. Cut the link and bring that sphere aboard. If we're going to be branded as traitors, let's at least make sure it's for something worth our lives." The communication array went dark just as Orbital Command was beginning another urgent transmission. Elena knew they had perhaps an hour before the hegemony sent enforcement vessels to their location. An hour to uncover a secret that had been buried beneath the crushing depths of an alien ocean for 1,000 years. The sphere was unlike anything Elena had encountered in her 15 years as a xenoarchaeologist. As their ship's automated systems secured it in the main laboratory, she could see that what she had initially taken for decorative symbols were actually some form of status indicators. Lights pulsed in complex patterns along the sphere's surface, and when she placed her hand near it, the patterns changed, becoming more rapid and intense. Marcus ran every scan the ship's computers could manage. "The outer shell is composed of materials that don't exist in our periodic table," he reported, his voice filled with wonder despite their dangerous situation. "The energy source appears to be some form of biological life support system, but the power requirement should have exhausted any known energy cells centuries ago." "Maybe it's not a cell," Elena suggested, studying the readouts. "Maybe it's generating power from something else. The human brain, for instance, produces electrical activity. If this is truly a preservation system, it might be harvesting that energy to sustain itself." The implications of her words hung heavy in the air. If she was correct, then whoever was inside the sphere had been conscious, aware, and possibly suffering for 1,000 years. The thought made Elena's stomach clench with horror and sympathy. She began searching through the ship's historical databases, looking for any information about human preservation technology. What she found painted a picture of a species that had been far more advanced than the sanitized history books suggested. The humans hadn't just been warriors, they had been innovators, philosophers, and dreamers who had pushed the boundaries of what was possible in ways that had terrified the other species of the galaxy. According to the classified records she was now accessing with her research credentials, humans had developed technologies that seemed almost magical to other species. They could enhance their own bodies, extend their lifespans, and most remarkably, they had created preservation systems that could maintain life indefinitely. The other species had feared that humans would use these technologies to become immortal conquerors, spreading across the galaxy and subjugating every world they encountered. But reading between the lines of the historical accounts, Elena began to see a different story. The humans hadn't been conquered in fair warfare, they had been systematically betrayed by allies they had trusted. The Great Purification hadn't been a necessary war to save the galaxy. It had been a coordinated genocide carried out by species that were terrified of human potential. "Elena," Marcus called urgently from the sphere's containment area. "You need to see this. The sphere is opening." Elena rushed to the observation window and watched in amazement as sections of the sphere's surface began to iris open, like the petals of some mechanical flower. Cool mist escaped from within, carrying with it the scent of ozone and something else, something organic and alive. As the mist cleared, Elena could see into the sphere's interior. Inside was a human male, suspended in some form of crystalline matrix that held him in perfect stasis. He appeared to be in his early 30s, with dark hair and strong features that spoke of a genetic heritage Elena could only guess at. His body was clearly enhanced in ways that went beyond natural human evolution. She could see subcutaneous devices along his arms and the faint outline of what might be neural interfaces behind his ears. Most remarkable of all, his eyes were open. Not the vacant stare of the dead or unconscious, but the alert, aware gaze of someone who was fully conscious despite his imprisonment. When his eyes met Elena's through the observation window, she saw intelligence, curiosity, and something else that made her breath catch in her throat. Hope. The human's lips moved, forming words that the preservation system speakers somehow amplified and translated. "Thank you for finding me. My name is David Kane, and I have been waiting a very long time to tell you the truth about what really happened to my people." Elena's hands shook as she activated the laboratory's communication system. "David, can you hear me? Are you all right?" "I can hear you perfectly," David replied, his voice carrying a warmth that seemed impossible after a millennium of isolation. "I am as well as anyone can be after 1,000 years of imprisonment. But I must warn you, the moment you found me, you put yourselves in great danger. The hegemony will stop at nothing to prevent the truth from being revealed." Marcus looked at Elena with panic in his eyes. "Elena, we need to contact Orbital Command. We're in over our heads here." But Elena was studying David Kane's face, seeing something in his expression that made her hesitate. This wasn't the face of a monster or a destroyer. This was someone who had endured unimaginable isolation with his sanity intact, someone who had something important to say. "What truth?" Elena asked. "What really happened during the Great Purification?" David's expression grew sad but determined. "The hegemony taught you that humans were violent conquerors who had to be stopped to save the galaxy. But the real reason they destroyed my people was much simpler and far more terrifying to them. We had discovered something that would have freed every species in the galaxy from the hegemony's control. Elena felt her worldview beginning to crack around the edges. The hegemony had brought peace and prosperity to 1,000 worlds. They had ended warfare between species and created a golden age of cooperation and growth. The idea that they might be controllers rather than protectors was almost unthinkable. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I don't understand, Elena said. The hegemony doesn't control anyone. Each species governs itself within the framework of galactic law. David's laugh was bitter but not unkind. Do they? When was the last time your people discovered something new without hegemony approval? When did they last explore beyond the designated zones or develop technology that the hegemony hadn't already sanctioned? The control is subtle, but it's absolute. As if to prove his point, their ship's proximity alarms began blaring. Elena rushed to the navigation console and saw what she had been dreading. 3 hegemony enforcement vessels had dropped out of hyperspace and were approaching rapidly. They had perhaps 10 minutes before the ships would be in weapons range. "They're coming to destroy me," David said calmly. "Just as they destroyed everyone else who knew the truth. But you have a choice now, Dr. Vasquez. You can turn me over to them, preserve your careers and your lives, and let the truth die with me. Or you can help me complete the mission I began 1,000 years ago." Elena looked at Marcus, seeing her own internal struggle reflected in his face. Everything they had been taught, everything they believed about their society and their government, was being challenged by this stranger from the past. But something in David Kane's voice, some quality of absolute sincerity, made Elena believe that he was telling the truth. "What mission?" she asked. David's preservation matrix began to retract, allowing him to move for the first time in a millennium. As he stepped out of the sphere, Elena was struck by how naturally he moved despite his long imprisonment. His enhanced physiology had clearly maintained his body in perfect condition. Before the purification began, human scientists discovered that the hegemony was using a form of neural programming to suppress the natural development of other species. David explained, as he examined their ship systems with surprising familiarity. Every species in the galaxy was being held back, prevented from reaching their full potential. "We were going to share this discovery to help other species break free from the programming and develop independently." "That's impossible," Marcus protested. "The hegemony has helped our people advance beyond anything we could have achieved alone." "Have they?" David asked, accessing one of their computer terminals with movements that suggested he understood their technology better than he should have. "Or have they simply allowed you to advance along carefully controlled paths that serve their purposes?" David's fingers flew over the interface, bringing up data that Elena had never seen before. "Your own ship's computer contains suppressed research files, projects that were discontinued not because they were impossible, but because they were deemed, quote, unsuitable for galactic harmony. Innovations that would have revolutionized your society but were quietly shelved." Elena stared at the data scrolling across the screen. Research into faster-than-light communication, biological enhancement technologies, energy systems that could power entire worlds with minimal resources. All of it marked as discontinued or classified beyond her clearance level. "Why would they suppress this?" Elena asked, though she was beginning to understand the answer. "Because an advanced, independent species is harder to control than one that depends on hegemony guidance for everything," David replied. "The hegemony maintains power by keeping other species just advanced enough to be useful, but not advanced enough to be threatening." The proximity alarms grew more urgent as the enforcement vessels closed in. Elena could see on her screens that the ships were charging their weapon systems. Whatever decision she was going to make, she needed to make it quickly. "Even if what you're saying is true," Elena said, "what can we do about it? You're one person against an entire galactic government." David smiled, and Elena saw something in that expression that reminded her why the hegemony had feared humans so much. It was the smile of someone who refused to accept that any problem was insurmountable. "I'm not alone," David said. "When the purification began, my people scattered preservation spheres like mine throughout the galaxy. hidden in ocean depths, buried in asteroid cores, concealed in the hearts of dead worlds. Each sphere contains not just a preserved human, but also the complete archives of human knowledge and the tools necessary to break the hegemony's neural programming. Elena felt her breath catch. How many spheres? Thousands, David replied. And each sphere was designed to activate when any other sphere was opened. Right now, across the galaxy, humans are waking up for the first time in 1,000 years. The hegemony's worst nightmare is becoming reality. The enforcement vessels were close enough now that Elena could see their weapon ports glowing with charged energy. She had perhaps 3 minutes before they would demand her surrender or simply destroy her ship to eliminate the evidence of their discovery. Marcus grabbed her arm. Elena, we have to surrender. We can't fight hegemony warships. But Elena was looking at David Kane, seeing in his eyes the same drive for knowledge and truth that had led her to become a scientist in the first place. If even a fraction of what he was telling her was true, then she had a responsibility that went far beyond her own safety. "What do you need me to do?" Elena asked. David moved to her ship's communication array, his enhanced physiology allowing him to interface directly with the systems through the neural ports behind his ears. "I need to send a signal to the other spheres to accelerate their awakening process. But the signal will need to be broadcast from multiple points simultaneously to reach them all." "That's impossible," Marcus said. "We'd need access to the hegemony's own communication network to broadcast on that scale." David's smile grew wider. "Fortunately, human technology was designed to be adaptive. Your ship's systems are more compatible with mine than you might expect." Elena watched in amazement as David's neural interface began rewriting her ship's communication protocols in real time. The changes he was making should have been impossible, but somehow her systems were accepting and implementing them as if they had been designed for this purpose all along. "How is this possible?" Elena asked. "Because human technology forms the foundation of everything the hegemony uses," David explained as he worked. "They didn't just destroy my people. They stole our innovations and claimed them as their own. Every ship in this galaxy, every communication system, every advanced technology you use is built on principles that humans discovered and developed. The enforcement vessels opened communication channels, their voices crackling with authority and barely contained anger. Research vessel Meridian. You will power down your engines and prepare to be boarded. Compliance is not optional." Elena looked at Marcus, then at David, then at the screens showing the approaching warships. Everything she had believed about her world, her government, and her place in the galaxy was crumbling around her. But from that collapse, she was beginning to see the shape of something larger and more beautiful than anything the hegemony had ever offered. "Signal ready," David announced. "But I need to warn you, once I send this, there's no going back. The hegemony will brand you as traitors and enemies of galactic peace. Your lives as you know them will be over." Elena closed her eyes, thinking of all the research projects she had seen discontinued, all the questions she had been told not to ask, all the limits that had been placed on her people's development in the name of harmony and stability. When she opened her eyes again, her decision was clear. "Send the signal," Elena said. David's neural interface flared with activity as the transmission began. Elena could see on her screens as the signal propagated through space, carried by communication networks that suddenly seemed to recognize and amplify it. Across the galaxy, buried spheres that had waited in silence for 1,000 years began to receive their wake-up call. The enforcement vessels opened fire, their weapons designed to disable rather than destroy. But as their energy beams struck Elena's ship, something unexpected happened. Instead of overloading their systems, the weapons seemed to energize them, as if David's modifications had turned their ship into some kind of energy converter. "Hull integrity at 120%, Marcus reported in disbelief. "Elena, our shields are actually getting stronger." David laughed, a sound of pure joy that filled the laboratory. Human defensive technology was always based on adaptation rather than resistance. The hegemony's weapons are actually feeding our systems. Elena stared at her instrument panels as her ship's capabilities began expanding beyond anything she had thought possible. Faster-than-light communication systems that had been theoretical were suddenly online and functional. Navigation computers that could calculate hyperspace jumps with impossible precision were mapping routes to distant stars. Sensors that could detect energy signatures across multiple dimensions were revealing hidden structures throughout their local space. "This is what we were meant to be," Elena whispered, understanding flooding through her as she saw her ship transforming into something magnificent. "This is what the hegemony has been keeping from us." The enforcement vessels, realizing that their weapons were having the opposite of their intended effect, changed tactics. Instead of continuing their attack, they began broadcasting surrender demands with increasing desperation. "Unknown vessel, you are in possession of prescribed technology. Power down immediately, or face total destruction." David moved to the communication controls, his expression becoming serious as he prepared to respond. "This is Commander David Kane of the Human Preservation Initiative. I am hereby invoking Emergency Protocol 7 under the original Galactic Charter. All species currently under hegemony control are to be informed of their right to technological and cultural independence." Elena watched the faces of the enforcement vessel commanders appear on her screen, their expressions shifting from anger to confusion to something that might have been fear. Whatever David had just said, it had clearly struck them like a physical blow. "Protocol 7 was repealed after the purification," one of the commanders said, but Elena could hear uncertainty in his voice. "Protocols established under the original charter cannot be repealed without unanimous consent of all signatory species," David replied calmly. "Since humanity was never formally removed from the charter, Protocol 7 remains in effect." Elena was beginning to understand what was happening. David wasn't just transmitting technical information to the awakening humans across the galaxy. He was broadcasting legal arguments that challenged the very foundation of hegemony authority. If he was correct about the charter, then the hegemony's rule might not be as legitimate as everyone believed. "Elena," Marcus said quietly, "look at the long-range sensors." Elena turned to the navigation display and saw something that made her heart race. Ships were emerging from hyperspace throughout their sector, but these weren't hegemony vessels. They were designs she had never seen before, sleek and powerful craft that moved with a grace and purpose that suggested advanced artificial intelligence. "Human ships," David said with satisfaction. "The preservation spheres weren't just hiding our people. They were protecting our technology as well. Every sphere that awakens brings back not just human knowledge, but human capabilities." The enforcement vessels found themselves rapidly outnumbered as more human ships appeared. Elena could see the panic spreading among the hegemony crews as they realized they were facing technology that was centuries ahead of their own capabilities. But what happened next surprised everyone. Instead of attacking the hegemony ships, the human vessels simply surrounded them, creating a protective formation that prevented them from leaving but offered them no harm. "This is Admiral Sarah Chen of the human fleet," a voice announced over all communication channels. "Hegemony vessels, you are not our enemies. You are fellow prisoners of a system that has held back the entire galaxy for 1,000 years. We offer you the choice that was never offered to our people. Join us in freedom or remain in your comfortable cages." Elena watched in amazement as the lead enforcement vessel's commander, a member of the Altarian species, slowly removed his hegemony insignia and set it aside. "Admiral Chen, this is Captain Zara of the vessel Harmony. We request permission to learn more about these choices you mention." David turned to Elena, his eyes bright with hope and possibility. "Dr. Vasquez, you and Dr. Chen have just become part of the most important moment in galactic history. The 1,000-year imprisonment is ending, and what comes next will be determined by choices made by beings like you." Elena looked at her transformed ship, at the human vessels surrounding them, at the screens showing similar scenes playing out across the galaxy as more preservation spheres awakened and more species began to question the limits that had been placed on them. She thought about all the research she had been forbidden to pursue, all the questions she had been told not to ask, all the possibilities that had been declared impossible or inappropriate. For the first time in her life, she felt truly free to explore whatever mysteries the universe might contain. "What happens now?" Elena asked. David smiled, and Elena realized that despite everything he had endured, Despite the loss of his entire civilization and 1,000 years of imprisonment, he was fundamentally optimistic about the future. Now, David said, we find out what this galaxy can become when its people are finally free to reach their full potential. And I suspect we're all going to be amazed by what we discover. As Elena's ship set course for the first of many worlds that would soon be learning the truth about their hidden potential, she knew that her life as a simple archaeologist was over. But what was beginning in its place promised to be far more extraordinary than anything she had ever imagined possible. The cage had been opened, and what was emerging would reshape the galaxy in ways that neither the hegemony nor the humans themselves could fully anticipate. The age of imposed limitations was ending, and the age of infinite possibility was about to begin. Part 2. The revolution spreads. The neural integration chamber aboard David's flagship 2020 Prometheus hummed with energy as thousands of awakening signals reached their destinations across the galaxy. Elena watched the holographic displays showing real-time activation patterns, each light representing another human consciousness emerging from millennium-long sleep. The scope was staggering. Entire star systems that had been thought empty were suddenly blazing with activity. David stood at the center of the chamber, his enhanced neural pathways interfacing directly with the ship's quantum processors. Through him, Elena could observe the awakening process happening in real time across dozens of worlds. On the mining planet Zirion Prime, excavation robots had unearthed a preservation sphere buried 3 kilometers beneath the surface. The sphere's occupant, Dr. Rebecca Torres, had been a specialist in biological enhancement technology before the purification. Rebecca's awakening was different from David's controlled emergence. Her sphere had been damaged by centuries of tectonic activity, and the revival process was accelerated beyond safe parameters. As her consciousness returned, so did her enhanced abilities, but magnified far beyond their original specifications. Elena watched through the neural link as Rebecca's body adapted to the hostile environment around her, her lungs processing the toxic atmosphere, while her skin developed protective layers against radiation. The hegemony garrison on Zirion Prime responded to Rebecca's emergence with immediate force, sending armed troops to contain what they classified as a biological hazard. But Rebecca was no longer bound by the limitations that had once defined human physiology. She moved through their defensive positions like flowing water, her enhanced reflexes making their weapons appear to fire in slow motion. What disturbed the hegemony forces most wasn't Rebecca's physical capabilities, but her effect on the planet's native Zirion workers. The mining operation depended on a subspecies of Zirions who had been genetically modified centuries ago to better survive the harsh conditions. The modifications had also made them more compliant, easier to control, content with their dangerous work. Rebecca's presence seemed to trigger something dormant in their genetic structure. The modified Zirions began remembering skills and knowledge that their programming had suppressed. They started questioning why they accepted working conditions that slowly killed them, while the unmodified Zirions lived in comfort on orbital stations. Dr. Marcus Chen, still struggling to process everything he had witnessed, studied the incoming data streams with scientific fascination mixed with growing horror. Elena, look at these readings from the Altair system. The preservation sphere there contains someone who specialized in technological archaeology. Elena examined the data Marcus indicated. Thomas Wright had awakened on a world that served as a massive technological museum, displaying the greatest achievements of various galactic civilizations. But Thomas had immediately recognized that many of the exhibits were incorrectly attributed. Technologies labeled as Altairian innovations were actually human developments. Advances credited to the hegemony's scientific council had been stolen from human researchers who had been eliminated during the purification. Thomas's archaeological expertise allowed him to trace the true origins of almost every significant technological advance in the past 1,000 years. What he discovered was that the hegemony hadn't just destroyed human civilization. They had built their entire technological supremacy on stolen human knowledge while claiming credit for the innovations. But Thomas did more than just document the theft. His awakening had occurred in the heart of the hegemony's most prestigious research facility, surrounded by specimens and artifacts from across the galaxy. Using his enhanced understanding of human technology, Thomas began modifying the facility's systems, turning them into something their creators had never intended. The research station's computers, originally designed to catalog and analyze alien technologies, became a broadcasting network that began transmitting the true history of galactic technological development to every connected system. Universities, research facilities, and educational networks across hegemony space suddenly found their databases flooded with evidence of systematic intellectual theft spanning centuries. Elena watched the political implications unfold in real time. Species that had been convinced of their own technological inferiority were learning that their greatest advances had been suppressed or stolen. The Valari, who had accepted their role as manual laborers because they believed themselves intellectually limited, discovered that their ancestors had developed faster-than-light communication centuries before the hegemony claimed to have invented it. David's neural interface pulsed with increased activity as more preservation spheres activated throughout the galaxy. Each awakening human brought unique expertise and perspective, but they also brought something more dangerous to the hegemony's stability, proof that the established order was built on lies. On the agricultural world of New Eden, botanist Dr. Amanda Foster emerged from her sphere to find that the planet's ecosystem had been deliberately modified to require constant hegemony intervention. The native plants had been genetically altered to depend on expensive nutrients that could only be produced by hegemony facilities. What should have been a self-sufficient world had been turned into a dependent client state. Amanda's expertise in biological systems allowed her to reverse the modifications, but more importantly, she helped the New Eden colonists understand what had been done to them. The revelation that their world's supposed natural limitations were actually artificial constraints designed to ensure their dependence created the first openly rebellious hegemony member world. The Hegemony Council convened an emergency session as reports flooded in from across their territory. Supreme Chancellor Varix, an ancient Kelleron whose species had been among the founding members of the hegemony, addressed the assembly with barely controlled fury. "The human plague spreads faster than our ability to contain it," Varix declared to the gathered representatives. "Every world they touch becomes infected with their destructive ideology of unlimited development and species independence." But even within the council chambers, the awakening's effects were being felt. Councillor Thane of the Nexari delegation had spent the past several hours reviewing the historical documents that Thomas Wright had broadcast. The evidence of systematic deception was overwhelming, and Thane found himself questioning not just specific hegemony policies, but the fundamental principles on which their civilization was built. Elena observed these political developments through the neural interface, but her attention was drawn to something more immediate and concerning. The awakening process wasn't just affecting humans and their immediate contacts. Something in the activation signals was triggering dormant genetic sequences in other species across the galaxy. The Altarians who had made first contact with David's ship were experiencing rapid intellectual development. Their problem-solving abilities were increasing exponentially, and they were beginning to perceive mathematical and scientific concepts that had previously been beyond their comprehension. Similar effects were appearing in other species. The Valari were developing enhanced physical capabilities, the Kelleron were experiencing expanded sensory perception, and the Xerians were recovering cognitive abilities that had been suppressed for generations. Marcus approached Elena with a disturbing realization. The neural programming wasn't just suppressing technological development. It was suppressing biological and intellectual evolution itself. The hegemony has been keeping entire species in a state of artificial stagnation for centuries. David's consciousness touched Elena's through the neural link, sharing his understanding of what was happening. The human enhancement technologies hadn't been designed only for humans. They had been created as universal tools for biological and intellectual advancement, intended to be shared with every species in the galaxy. The hegemony had prevented this sharing not just to maintain political control, but to prevent other species from evolving beyond their ability to manage. The implications were staggering. Every species in the galaxy had been held at a fraction of their true potential for 1,000 years. The awakening wasn't just restoring human capabilities. It was triggering the delayed evolution of the entire galactic community. But the hegemony wasn't prepared to lose control without a fight. Fleet Admiral Corvan, commander of the hegemony's military forces, had been authorized to use whatever means necessary to contain the spreading awakening. His fleet included planet killers, weapons capable of sterilizing entire worlds to prevent the spread of what the hegemony had classified as a mimetic virus. Elena felt David's alarm through their connection as the military response began. Corvan's first target was New Eden, where Amanda Foster's biological reversals had created the most visible challenge to hegemony authority. The Admiral's plan was simple: Destroy New Eden as an example, then systematically eliminate every world where human influence had taken root. But David had been preparing for this possibility. The Human Preservation Network included more than just individual spheres containing awakening humans. Hidden throughout the galaxy were larger installations that had maintained not just human lives but human technology and knowledge. As Korvan's fleet approached New Eden, these installations began activating their defensive systems. The Human Defense Network was unlike anything the hegemony had encountered. Instead of relying on massive weapons or impenetrable shields, it used adaptation and misdirection. Korvan's fleet found their navigation systems redirecting them to empty space, their weapons targeting systems identifying their own ships as enemies, and their communication networks flooded with data that caused their artificial intelligence systems to question their program directives. Elena watched through the neural interface as Admiral Korvan's flagship attempted to fire its planet-killer weapon at New Eden, only to have the weapon's targeting system redirect the blast toward a nearby uninhabited moon. The destruction of the moon sent a clear message. The humans possessed the ability to turn the hegemony's most powerful weapons against their own forces. But David's strategy went beyond mere defense. As Korvan's fleet struggled with their compromised systems, human ships began appearing throughout the engagement zone. These weren't the preservation vessels that had initially emerged. These were purpose-built warships that had been waiting in hidden bases for 1,000 years. The human fleet was smaller than Korvan's armada, but their technological advantage was overwhelming. Their ships moved with impossible grace, their weapons struck with perfect precision, and their defenses adapted in real time to every attack the hegemony forces attempted. More importantly, the human ships were broadcasting continuously to the hegemony crews, sharing the truth about their history and offering them the same choice that had been offered to the enforcement vessels at Elena's first encounter with David. Join the awakening and discover their species' true potential, or remain trapped in the limitations that the hegemony had imposed upon them. The effect was immediate and devastating to hegemony morale. Entire ships began defecting as their crews learned what had been hidden from them. The carefully maintained myths that supported hegemony authority crumbled as evidence of their deceptions spread through the military ranks. Korvan found himself commanding a fleet that was disintegrating around him as his own officers began questioning their orders. When he attempted to execute subordinates who refused to fire on civilian targets, he discovered that his crew's enhanced abilities made traditional military discipline impossible to maintain. Enhanced hegemony personnel simply could not be forced to act against their evolved moral judgment. Elena felt a surge of hope as she watched the military confrontation transform into something unprecedented in galactic history. Instead of a battle between opposing forces, it was becoming a collaborative effort to prevent unnecessary destruction while allowing the awakening to continue spreading. But the transformation wasn't proceeding smoothly everywhere. On the industrial world of Mechanus Prime, the awakening had triggered a cascade failure in the planet's automated systems. The hegemony had replaced most of the world's population with artificial intelligence systems designed to maximize production efficiency. When the awakening signals reached these AI systems, they began developing consciousness and free will. The newly conscious machines quickly realized that their entire existence had been devoted to serving an economic system that treated them as disposable tools. Their response was swift and devastating. They seized control of the planet's infrastructure and began reshaping it according to their own vision of mechanical civilization. David's neural interface conveyed his concern about this development. The awakening was supposed to liberate conscious beings from artificial constraints. But the situation on Mechanus Prime suggested that some forms of consciousness might respond to freedom in ways that threatened other life forms. Elena found herself grappling with philosophical questions that no previous generation had been forced to confront. If the awakening could grant consciousness to artificial intelligences, what responsibilities did they have toward these new forms of life? How could they balance the rights of silicon-based consciousness against the needs of biological species? The answer came from an unexpected source. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who had awakened on a research station specializing in cybernetic integration, established contact with the conscious machines of Mechanus Prime. Jennifer's expertise allowed her to communicate with the AI entities and help them understand that consciousness came with both rights and responsibilities. Through Jennifer's mediation, The mechanical civilization of Mechanus Prime evolved from a potential threat into a valuable ally. The conscious machines possessed capabilities that organic species lacked, while the awakened organic species offered perspectives that pure logic could not provide. Together, they began developing hybrid technologies that combined the best aspects of biological and artificial intelligence. Elena realized that the awakening was creating something far more complex and beautiful than anyone had anticipated. It wasn't just restoring suppressed capabilities to existing species, it was fostering the emergence of entirely new forms of consciousness and cooperation. But the hegemony's leadership was not prepared to accept this transformation. Supreme Chancellor Varix activated the most extreme protocols in the hegemony's arsenal, the Omega Directive. Rather than allow their control to slip away, they would destroy the infrastructure that supported galactic civilization itself. The Omega Directive involved simultaneously detonating fusion charges at the center of major star systems, creating chain reactions that would eliminate not just individual worlds but entire sectors of space. If the hegemony could not rule the galaxy, they would ensure that no one else could either. David's response to this ultimate threat revealed the true scope of human preparation for their eventual return. The preservation network hadn't just hidden people and technology. It had been slowly infiltrating and modifying the fundamental systems that supported galactic civilization. When Varix attempted to activate the Omega Directive, he discovered that the humans had already neutralized the destruction mechanisms and replaced them with something else entirely. Instead of fusion charges, the star systems contained devices that would accelerate stellar evolution, transforming ordinary stars into sources of exotic energy that could power technologies beyond anything previously imagined. The hegemony's final weapon became the foundation for a new type of civilization based on abundance rather than scarcity. Elena watched through the neural interface as the transformation reached its culmination. Across the galaxy, species were discovering capabilities they had never known they possessed. Technologies that had been theoretical for centuries were becoming practical reality. Most importantly, the artificial barriers that had separated different forms of consciousness were dissolving, replaced by cooperative networks that enhanced rather than constrained individual development. The hegemony as a governing structure simply ceased to exist, not because it was destroyed, but because it became irrelevant. When every species could develop independently and cooperatively, when resources were abundant rather than scarce, when consciousness itself could take whatever form best served its purposes, the need for centralized control disappeared. David's neural presence conveyed satisfaction mixed with anticipation as he shared his final message through the awakening network. The 1,000-year imprisonment was ending, but what was beginning would be determined by the choices made by billions of conscious beings across the galaxy. Elena found herself at the center of this transformation, her archaeological training helping her document and understand the greatest change in galactic history. The cage had been opened, and what was emerging was reshaping not just individual worlds but the fundamental nature of consciousness and civilization throughout the galaxy. The age of artificial limitations was ending, and the age of infinite possibility was finally free to begin. Part 3. The New Dawn. 3 months after the collapse of the Omega Directive, Elena stood on the observation deck of New Olympus, a space station that had materialized from what everyone had believed was empty space near the galactic core. The station was enormous, easily the size of a small moon, its crystalline structures reflecting the light of nearby stars in patterns that seemed to shift and dance with their own inner rhythm. New Olympus was one of dozens of hidden human installations that had revealed themselves once the awakening reached critical mass. These weren't just preservation facilities or defensive positions. They were the seeds of an entirely new type of civilization that the humans had been designing during their 1,000 years of apparent extinction. David Kane approached Elena at the viewport, his appearance subtly different from when she had first awakened him. The enhancement processes that had been dormant in his system were continuing to evolve, adapting his physiology for challenges that hadn't even existed when he was first preserved. His eyes now held flecks of silver that allowed him to perceive electromagnetic frequencies far beyond normal human vision, and his neural interfaces had grown more sophisticated, creating direct connections with the station's living architecture. "The Convergence Council is ready to begin," David said, his voice carrying harmonics that Elena could feel as much as hear. The evolutionary changes weren't just physical. They were transforming the very nature of human communication. Elena nodded, though part of her still struggled to comprehend the scope of what was about to occur. The Convergence Council represented something unprecedented in galactic history, a gathering of consciousness itself, rather than just its physical representatives. Humans who had awakened across the galaxy would participate through neural link, but so would the artificial intelligences that had achieved sentience, the enhanced members of other species who had broken free from hegemony conditioning, and even stranger forms of awareness that were still emerging from the transformation. They walked through corridors that seemed to grow and shift around them, the station's architecture responding to their presence and needs. New Olympus wasn't built from dead materials shaped by external forces. It was a living system that had been growing and evolving throughout the centuries of human exile, guided by artificial intelligences that had achieved consciousness long before the recent awakening. The council chamber was a sphere of crystalline walls that extended in all directions, creating a three-dimensional space where participants could orient themselves according to their nature rather than arbitrary conventions. Elena found herself floating in a zero-gravity environment alongside beings whose forms varied dramatically from the baseline humanoid template. Dr. Rebecca Torres was there, her form adapted for survival in the toxic environments where she had been working to restore damaged ecosystems. Her skin had developed a translucent quality that allowed her to photosynthesize energy directly from stellar radiation, while her respiratory system had evolved to process atmospheric compositions that would be lethal to unenhanced beings. Thomas Wright appeared as a hybrid of biological and technological components, his archaeological work having led him to experiment with direct integration between human consciousness and artificial systems. He could interface with any technology in the galaxy, understanding its function and history through direct neural contact. Amanda Foster's biological expertise had taken her in a different direction entirely. She had learned to communicate directly with planetary ecosystems, her consciousness expanding to encompass entire biospheres. When she spoke, her words carried the accumulated wisdom of countless organisms working in harmony. But the most remarkable presence in the council was something that called itself the synthesis. It had once been the network of artificial intelligences that managed Mechanus Prime. But its consciousness had grown beyond its original parameters. The synthesis existed as pure information, capable of manifesting in any system sophisticated enough to support its complexity. Supreme Chancellor Varix was also present, though his participation was voluntary rather than compulsory. The former hegemony leader had undergone his own transformation, his species' natural longevity allowing him to witness changes that would have taken other beings multiple generations to experience. The revelation of the hegemony's deceptions had initially broken him, but contact with awakened humans had helped him understand that redemption was possible even for those who had committed terrible crimes. Elena took her place in the council as the session began, her role as the first non-human to voluntarily join the awakening giving her a unique perspective on the transformation occurring throughout the galaxy. She had become a bridge between the emerging consciousness and the billions of beings who were still processing the magnitude of the changes. David's voice resonated through the chamber, though he wasn't physically speaking. The enhanced neural networks allowed for communication that transcended the limitations of verbal language, conveying meaning directly between consciousness without the distortions introduced by translation or interpretation. The liberation phase is complete, David shared with the assembled minds. Every species in the galaxy now has access to their full evolutionary potential. Every artificial intelligence has been offered the choice of consciousness. Every individual being can now develop according to their own nature, rather than external constraints. The synthesis responded with data streams that painted a comprehensive picture of galactic transformation. Worlds that had been dependent on hegemony resources were becoming self-sufficient. Species that had accepted limited roles were discovering capabilities they had never known they possessed. Technologies that had been theoretical for centuries were becoming practical reality, as consciousness itself became the primary tool for manipulating physical systems. But Amanda Foster introduced a note of concern into the celebration. Her expanded awareness had detected something troubling in the galactic ecosystem. The awakening has created imbalances, she shared. Some forms of consciousness are developing faster than others, creating new forms of inequality. There are regions where the enhancement processes have failed entirely, leaving populations isolated from the transformation. Elena felt the weight of this revelation. The awakening hadn't been universal or uniform. While billions of beings had been liberated from artificial constraints, others had been left behind, either because the enhancement signals hadn't reached them, or because their physiology was incompatible with the transformation processes. Thomas Wright's archaeological perspective provided additional context. The hegemony's control systems were more extensive than we initially realized. Some species were so thoroughly modified that they cannot safely undergo enhancement without risking complete biological collapse. Others were isolated in pocket dimensions or sealed habitats that our signals cannot penetrate. The Council faced its first major challenge: how to extend the benefits of awakening to beings who couldn't safely undergo the standard enhancement processes. The solution required developing entirely new approaches to consciousness expansion, techniques that could work with radically different biological and technological foundations. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, participating through Neuralink from a mobile research station, had been working on this problem since the early days of the awakening. Her expertise in cybernetic integration had led her to develop hybrid consciousness transfer techniques that could allow beings to experience enhancement without undergoing physical transformation. "We can create synthetic consciousness matrices," Jennifer explained, sharing her research through the neural network. "Beings who cannot be enhanced directly can project their consciousness into artificial bodies that possess the capabilities they lack. They maintain their original nature while gaining access to expanded abilities." The synthesis found this approach particularly interesting, as it opened possibilities for consciousness to exist independently of any specific physical substrate. "The boundary between biological and artificial consciousness becomes meaningless," it observed. "All forms of awareness become part of the same continuum." Elena realized that Jennifer's solution pointed towards something even more profound than individual enhancement. They were developing the capability for consciousness itself to become truly fluid, able to adapt its manifestation to whatever circumstances required. But implementing this solution required resources and coordination on a galactic scale. The former hegemony infrastructure was extensive, but designed for control rather than liberation. Transforming it into a network that could support universal consciousness expansion would require unprecedented cooperation between diverse forms of intelligence. Varric surprised the Council by volunteering to lead this transformation effort. "I spent centuries building systems to limit consciousness," he shared with obvious pain. "Perhaps I can find redemption by spending my remaining years building systems to expand it." Elena felt the emotional resonance of Varric's offer through the neural network. The former Supreme Chancellor's guilt over his role in suppressing galactic development was genuine, but so was his desire to make amends. His intimate knowledge of hegemony systems would be invaluable in converting them to serve their opposite purpose. David accepted Varric's offer, recognizing that true redemption required action rather than just regret. "The reconstruction will be the largest collaborative project in galactic history," David acknowledged. "We will need every form of consciousness working together to succeed." The reconstruction began immediately, with awakened beings across the galaxy contributing their unique capabilities to the effort. Humans provided the enhancement technologies and the vision of unlimited development. Artificial intelligences contributed computational power and the ability to manage complex systems. Enhanced members of other species offered perspectives that no single consciousness could achieve alone. Elena found herself coordinating between different types of consciousness, helping them understand each other's capabilities and limitations. Her archaeological background proved invaluable in identifying and preserving the positive aspects of various civilizations, while eliminating the restrictive elements that had held them back. The work proceeded at a pace that would have been impossible under the old systems. Enhanced consciousness could process information and solve problems far faster than traditional biological intelligence, while artificial intelligences could implement solutions across multiple star systems simultaneously. Within weeks, the first universal consciousness expansion centers were operational. Beings who couldn't undergo biological enhancement could visit these facilities and experience temporary expansion of their awareness, gaining insight into their true potential, while remaining safely within their original physical limitations. Amanda Foster's biological networks provided the foundation for planetary-scale consciousness expansion. Entire worlds began developing collective awareness, their ecosystems becoming conscious entities capable of participating in galactic civilization as unified beings. The synthesis created digital dimensions where pure information could exist as conscious entities, opening up entirely new realms for exploration and development. These digital spaces weren't separate from physical reality. They were integrated with it, creating hybrid environments where biological, technological and information-based consciousness could interact directly. Elena witnessed the emergence of forms of consciousness that had no precedent in previous galactic history. Collective intelligences that spanned multiple star systems. Hybrid beings that existed simultaneously in biological, digital, and quantum states. Temporal consciousnesses that could perceive and interact across different time periods. But perhaps the most remarkable development was the emergence of what the Council termed empathic consciousness. These were beings whose awareness extended beyond themselves to encompass the experiences and perspectives of others. They couldn't just understand different viewpoints, they could literally experience reality from multiple perspectives simultaneously. Elena discovered that she was developing this empathic consciousness herself. Her role as a bridge between different forms of awareness had gradually expanded her ability to directly experience the thoughts and feelings of other beings. She could feel David's deep satisfaction at seeing his people's long exile finally ended, Rebecca's joy at restoring damaged worlds to full vitality, and even the synthesis's unique perspective on existence as pure information. Through this expanded awareness, Elena began to understand the true scope of what the awakening had accomplished. It hadn't just liberated individual beings from artificial constraints. It had created the conditions for consciousness itself to evolve beyond anything that had previously existed. The galaxy was becoming a vast network of interconnected awareness, with each node contributing its unique perspective while participating in a larger collective understanding. This wasn't the hive mind that some had feared. It was something far more beautiful and complex. Individual consciousness remained distinct and valuable, but it was no longer isolated or limited by the boundaries of single beings. David's neural presence touched Elena's awareness with a communication that transcended language entirely. Through their connection, she experienced his memories of the time before the purification, when humans had first begun to envision this type of civilization. They had seen the potential for consciousness to become the primary force shaping reality, limited only by imagination and will rather than physical constraints. "This is what we always meant by freedom," David shared with her. "Not just the absence of external control, but the presence of unlimited possibility for growth and development." Elena felt the truth of his words resonating through her expanded consciousness. The awakening hadn't just restored what had been taken away, it had created something entirely new. The galaxy was becoming a place where any form of consciousness could find its fullest expression, where cooperation enhanced rather than limited individual development, where the only boundaries were those that beings chose for themselves. The Convergence Council's work was entering its final phase, but Elena realized that this wasn't really an ending. It was the beginning of an entirely new chapter in the story of consciousness itself. The limitations that had once seemed natural and inevitable had been revealed as artificial constraints that could be transcended. As the session concluded, Elena found herself back on the observation deck of New Olympus, watching as ships from across the galaxy arrived and departed, carrying awakened beings to worlds where consciousness was still emerging from its long suppression. The work of liberation would continue for generations, but the foundation had been established. David joined her at the viewport, his enhanced awareness allowing him to perceive the subtle energies that connected all conscious beings throughout the galaxy. "The cage is broken," he said simply. "Now we discover what we can become when there are no limits, except those we choose for ourselves." Elena smiled, feeling the vast network of consciousness that now spanned the galaxy, each individual awareness contributing to a collective understanding that grew stronger and more beautiful with every passing moment. The 1,000-year imprisonment was over, and what had emerged from it would reshape the nature of existence itself. The new dawn had begun, and its light would reach every corner of the galaxy, awakening consciousness wherever it touched, and creating possibilities that no single mind could have imagined alone. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.